Hello, I'm Chiara Ronchini and I'm Policy Manager with Historic Environment Scotland. And I'll tell you a little bit more about my organisation later. I have the difficult job of being the first keynote of the first session, and it comes with a little bit of responsibility. So I feel like I have the duty to set the scene. My presentation is going to focus on futures thinking approaches to recovery and renewal for culture organizations and really any organizations in times of crisis. So hopefully my presentation will be an introduction to the conference from an organizational point of view before delving into the core of the conference with all the other wonderful speakers. It is very challenging indeed for organizations to respond to a crisis and plan for recovery when facing many unknown variables. So, if you can think of your organization, what are the future uncertainties that your organization is facing right now? On a very general level, organizations have been dealing with the same global variables as anyone else, but they're facing different implications on a local level. And some of the variables that you might have thought about as well, for instance, are the severity of the pandemic and how the disease is going to progress. We're still quite unsure that how that's going to pan out. We also don't know what the long-term economic consequences are going to be. We don't know how quickly the economy is going to recover. We also are not quite sure how the healthcare system is going to respond to this, and we've seen this differs from country to country, and within the country itself, it is patchy. We don't know what long-term psychological impacts all these quarantines and lockdowns might have on people, and what sort of other impacts on people in general, like for instance in terms of social cohesion, these lockdowns might have. So we can't really predict what these variables are going to do. We have no crystal ball and we cannot predict the future. But depending on what these different variables might do, we'll have different possible scenarios. And futures thinking does exactly that. It helps organizations plan for different possible scenarios and become more future proof, more aware of potential changing conditions, more adaptive and more responsive to change. And future tools can really help organizations build on their strategy and operations. They can also capture external trends, especially if using horizon scanning techniques. And by doing that, it can really help organizations plan their resources better, looking at what might change in the future, planning for change and planning for different scenarios. I'll like to talk now about my organisation, Historic Environment Scotland, which I use as a case study. And I'll look at what we did to embed futures practices in the organisations, both at strategic and operational levels. First of all, Historic Environment Scotland is the national agency for the protection and promotion of heritage in Scotland. We came into being as an organisation 5 years ago as a merger of two long-established predecessor bodies. And this is our vision. Scotland's historic environment is cherished, understood, shared and enjoyed with pride by everyone. And what do we mean by historic environment? We really go by very broad definition of heritage, really considering all its tangible and intangible elements, from castles to standing stones and collection items, from collective memory and social history to storytelling. and ephemera as the pictures you can see here on this slide. So basically, it's anything that can contribute to giving a holistic and diverse picture of what heritage means to communities. And it builds a comprehensive sense of place and belonging for people. So we do have a very varied and challenging remit. And how do we deliver on this vision? We look after the historic environment in Scotland, which includes hundreds of properties in our care and also 6 World Heritage Sites, 50,000 listed buildings, 40 battlefields, but also we look after physical collections and digital archives, including 5 million photographs and drawings and tens of millions of various photos. And I've got more numbers for you. Um, we have 1,600 employees. We administer and distribute 14.5 million pound grants. In 2019-20, we had 5 million visitors visiting our properties in our care. And we very much rely on these visitors for our income. And this is a very crucial, very important point for us because due to the pandemic and the various lockdowns, we were forced to close a lot of our properties. And last year, we only had 250,000 visitors, which means we had much reduced income. So we were forced to rethink our model to improve our sustainability and flexibility to withstand crisis as an organization. And that's where futures thinking comes into play. Historic Environment Scotland is facing the same challenges probably as other organizations, and critical uncertainties such as budget and resources are definitely exacerbated by COVID just now. So we really looked at how to embed futures thinking to shape a sustainable model for our organization. And we looked at how futures thinking can contribute to all our 4 phases of response to COVID, which are the respond, reflect, resume, and reimagine phase. But we really looked at the different horizon in time. We looked at the 3 to 5 years horizon. So now I'd really like to talk to you about the methodology, what we did, the outcomes so far, the lessons learned, and the next steps. Starting with our scenario planning approach based on a Deloitte model scenario, which I'm going to talk to you about. Followed by our pestle analysis to look at critical uncertainties and the implications on the cultural heritage sector and our organization. To finish with the heightened priorities we identified to refocus our energy. So the whole futures thinking process for us started in June 2020. And this was delivered very much in line with the Scottish Government futures approach based on the Deloitte scenario model I was mentioning. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this one without really going much into detail. But this scenario model is based on 2 main variables, which are the severity of the pandemic and the level of collaboration between countries and within a country. And these 2 main variables shape 4 different possible scenarios depending on the position of the variables on this matrix that you can see here on this slide. So without going into much more detail, however, if you are interested, I definitely recommend to go on the Deloitte website for more information. Starting from scenario 1, we got passing storm right at the bottom of this chart. Passing storm happens when the pandemic is over very quickly and we are back as a country, as an organization to business as usual. The other extreme, so right on the other side of the curve, we find lone wolves, which is another scenario where countries can't contain the pandemic. There is a rise in isolationism and xenophobia. And obviously, the economy is really badly hit and impacted by this. In between, we got two in-betweeny scenarios. We got good company, which sees private companies stepping up to find a solution, but the pandemic is not over. The disease is progressing in waves. We also got another scenario, the fourth one, sunrise in the east, which sees the rise of East Asian nations that are able to contain the pandemic successfully. They are therefore able to recover their economy more quickly than the rest of the world, while the rest of the world still struggles. So you've probably seen some of these scenarios happening already during this year, and probably you can see some of these scenarios happening right now. But the important point of this exercise that we need to remember is that all four scenarios are equally possible. So when we are looking at the four scenarios and potential implications of the four scenarios, we need to plan as all these four scenarios are equally likely to happen. So what we did with Historic Environment Scotland, we looked at the opportunities for our organisation in each scenario, and we looked at what we could do. The actions that came up in every scenario were the ones that we decided to prioritize because we could take on regardless of scenario. So after this scenario planning exercise, we broke down the analysis even further and tailored the pestle analysis model to our own organization. And this is a model you may know already about. It's a model that explores opportunities in 6 different areas: political, economic, social, technology, environmental, and legal. And this analysis phase for us lasted a couple of months as we were weighing up all different implications for the cultural heritage sector and for Historic Environment Scotland in each of these areas. And just to give you an example, looking at the environmental theme, we explored the main global drivers and also more local drivers as well. And we looked at the opportunities and threats for our organizations and the sector. For instance, in terms of global drivers, I'm going to summarize now the work that we did very briefly. In terms of global drivers, for instance, we looked at how the climate change emergency, or how COP26 can offer opportunities for the sector and for Historic Environment Scotland. And more on a local basis, we looked at how Scottish Government targets for zero carbon by 2050 can also provide opportunities for, say, focus on retrofitting traditional buildings and contributing towards green recovery, which are key priorities for our organisation. So we found that both the Deloitte scenario model and the pestle, which you might be more familiar with, together, the combination of the two together was very useful. The Deloitte model is something from the financial world, which we're able to tailor more to our experience. It's something that is quite new, combined with something more trialed and tested like pestle. We found it was a great combination, which worked really well for us. So from the analysis and the workshops, we identified 5 heightened priorities, which are green recovery, sustainable tourism, localism, skills, children, and young people. And these aren't really new priorities for us, but they give focus to our operations for the next 3 to 5 years. These heightened priorities have all actions underneath each of them to improve the resilience and adaptability of historic environment Scotland. Our vision that we saw before remains very much a relevant and essential part of who we are. But actually, this futures thinking exercise has never been so timely because of the increased demand on resources and budget. And we have the need to clearly prioritize activity and be more forward looking to increase really the sustainability of our organization and focus our energy on what's important. We used really Historic Environment Scotland as a guinea pig during this pandemic. And all the learning we've been doing is going towards the compilation of a future toolkit. The toolkit will feature future tools like scenarios and horizon scanning, and also tools to explore the dynamics of change, such as pestle or mapping critical uncertainties. So ultimately, the aim of this toolkit is to be used by different areas across the whole organization to be more proactive, collaborative, and build long-term sustainability. We also developed a virtual intelligence hub as a central digital repository for the whole of HES, of Historic Environment Scotland, to really share intelligence and inform policy and strategy. We are really hoping that in the future we'll be able to share this platform externally as well with the whole culture sector and hopefully beyond as well. Throughout this process, we did employ service design approaches to widen participation, for doing things a bit differently to get fresher perspective on possible futures. And we involved our youth forum, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about just now. Our youth forum is a partnership with an external organization called Young Scots. We recruited 35 young people between the age of 9 and 25 from a huge diversity of backgrounds. And these young people participated in futures workshops with Historic Environment Scotland directors and staff and really shaped our future plans. And you can see here an example from this future skills workshop that we delivered. And you can see all the ideas, thoughts, plans that were captured during this session on the Miro board. So this was for us very much a new approach. We really never done something like this before. We never included young people in the strategic planning for the culture sector and for our organization. And it worked really well. So well that we continued working with the youth forum and we involved them in the decision-making processes through many different co-design approaches. So I've almost come to the end here, and I'd like now to share some lessons with you, looking at what worked well, what didn't work so well. The pandemic was the unfortunate but very timely event for Historic Environment Scotland to test and embed futures techniques. But this is very much the beginning of a long journey, for a long process for Historic Environment Scotland. And whilst 10 years would have been the optimal horizon to focus on with our futures thinking work, we looked at 3 to 5 years. This wasn't the ideal horizon, but it was a compromise for us. And it was already a success, as usually my organization, as probably most public bodies as well around the world, would actually use 1 year as horizon because of our funding and our financial setup and all different limitations that come from that. So this was already a step forward for us. This futures thinking process has been very helpful to become more proactive and build some sustainability in our strategy and operations. It helped us focus our time, our resources, and energy on what's important. And whilst this work has come about from an unfortunate global situation, it has enabled us to think creatively about what we do and enabled us to develop a set of heightened priorities and actions. So it basically really helped us plan our future, not just for a COVID scenario, but for any future crisis or any futures, really. Now, I'm really looking forward to sharing our experience and methodology so that it can hopefully be helpful to other organizations as well. And ultimately, we hope to learn from others too and use this international conference as a fantastic opportunity to do so. I really hope that we'll have the chance to discuss this together and welcome any questions you may have. Thank you.